something that I've been interested in because of her work, is this materializing picture of the larger network. You know, the idea that we're trying to be sold that Epstein is the end of this thing or Maxwell is the end of this thing, when in reality, this seems to be pointing to the larger network that they're trying to keep us from seeing. And that's very important. So Whitney Webb, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back on. Always great to be here.
Always a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure they're eager to hear your take on all this, since it's been this Epstein case, as much as I do think that it's being used in some way to keep us from looking at other things, it is still one of the most important cases I think we've ever been, in living memory, in my opinion, that has happened in this country, not just because of Epstein and Maxwell, but what your work is touching on, I would argue, today. So first, before we get into all the ins and outs, for those that may not have seen the development of this up until this point and the case in general, can you let people know what this case was, the actual the case in regard to Deutsche Bank, and before we get to the tie-in with Epstein and Maxwell and everything else, and what that case was about?
Right. So Esther Salas, the judge whose family was targeted, was assigned less than a week ago to oversee this case regarding Jeffrey Epstein and Deutsche Bank. What's interesting, though, is that this case technically wasn't supposed to happen, because what took place is that the New York State Department of Finance settled with Deutsche Bank over these concerns about them not cutting Epstein off as a client when they should have years ago, right? And so they settled for a fine of $150 million, and that was supposed to be the end of it, right? But what happened instead is that several investors in Deutsche Bank decided to file a class action lawsuit against the bank over this issue, arguing that what the New York State Department of Finance did not go far enough. And so that's where this case, that's essentially what this case is about. It has to do with the fact that Deutsche Bank recognized Epstein as being high risk as early as 2015. And then anti-money laundering compliance officers, and that pretty much every year from 2015 on, flagged Epstein as a high-risk individual, and nothing was done at the bank. And of course, when they did start, Deutsche Bank did finally start to shut down Epstein's accounts, of which he had dozens. It was in late 2018, and they did so over a period of several months, allowing him to move funds out, right? They didn't terminate his funds all at once. They did it gradually. And the last accounts they closed like 2 weeks before he was arrested last July. So they kept him, pretty much able to use the banking services, at least to an extent, pretty much right up until his arrest. When he had already been tipped off, Epstein himself, right? Because before he was arrested, he did things like, import a cement mixing truck to the island, the Epstein Island or whatever, to, presumably destroy evidence or cover things up. Right. Around the same time, Deutsche Bank was finally closing all of his accounts. Right.
And just interject real quick, I just add that we should recognize, for those hearing this, for the first time, there's a level of complicity there in regard to the bank that is very apparent, not a sidestep. It was acknowledged he was high risk. They chose to continue allowing his money to flow, and recognize that nobody involved in that situation, outside of this case, is actually, as of yet, being held accountable. That just draws parallel to me in regard to foreign policy and CIPRI saying that we arm all the worst people around the world, and and so on. So it's interesting tie in there. They're complicit. No one did anything. Please continue.
Right. Well, what's interesting too is that most of other banks that were publicly tied to Epstein before cut him off between 2012 and 2013, with him then moving to Deutsche Bank, which would, accept him when places like JP Morgan would not. Right. So it's also worth pointing out, in the same period of time while Epstein was banking there, Deutsche Bank was the subject of numerous money laundering probes, including by the US government and other governments in Europe, and I believe elsewhere as well. They paid like $14.5 billion in fines over money laundering. But of course, nothing actually happened. And then Deutsche Bank claimed that there was a bug in their money laundering software, or anti-money laundering software, that allowed them to allegedly monitor suspicious transactions and things like that. So a lot of red flags. And what's interesting is that the guy that is Bill Barr's pick to become the new district attorney in SDNY actually previously represented Deutsche Bank in one of those anti-money laundering probes involving them being connected to this major money laundering probe for organized crime syndicates in Russia. But it's worth pointing out that those same Russian organized crime figures also have a lot of overlap with Israeli organized crime. Right. So definitely interesting to point that out, because a lot of people had sort of suspected that Geoffrey Berman being fired by Bill Barr had to do with the arrest that followed not that long after of Ghislaine Maxwell, right? But it appears, in my opinion anyway, to be more related potentially to Deutsche Bank, because Berman was investigating or preparing cases, allegedly anyway, regarding Trump's finances with Deutsche Bank. And of course, the Kushners are also very, have some shady Deutsche Bank connections as well. So I think that may be, a bigger part of the case than people are willing to acknowledge, right? Because what has been the focus of a lot of stuff in the Epstein case has been the sexual blackmail operation, right? But as far as we know, that ended when Epstein was arrested the first time, if not a little earlier, around 2006, 2007. So, that's basically something that, is not currently relevant in the sense of it's not currently ongoing or didn't stop, up until his arrest last year, for example. It's been, over a decade. But what has continued is his involvement in these shady financial activities, which both, continued after his first arrest and also preceded his involvement in the sexual blackmail operation with Ghislaine Maxwell, which of course started in 1991, but throughout the 1980s and also the late 1970s, Epstein was doing a lot of shady stuff for Wall Street, for weapons dealers, like hiding and hunting down money on behalf of governments and major corporations, doing a lot of shady financial activity. So, and let's remember too that a lot of people in his black book that haven't gotten a lot of coverage are people like Leon Black or other massive hedge fund managers on Wall Street, right? Or he had close ties with the former heads of Bear Stearns, of JP Morgan. A lot of people who visited him when he was in jail the first time, or were frequent regular visitors, were Wall Street bankers, right? Yeah. So this is definitely like the part of the case, in my opinion, the core of the case that, the most powerful people really don't want coming out more than, these alleged tapes of people being involved with minors. There's a lot of financial crimes that could be exposed in a big way.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue they probably in their same way tie back to that same nefarious type of activity. But let me read a part what you wrote at the end of the article here. You put, well, Epstein's egregious and criminal actions targeting minors have now become public knowledge in role in facilitating white-collar crime, money laundering, and financial frauds on behalf of corporations, governments, and oligarchs remains solely undercovered in the news, despite his role in such activities preceding and continuing after his involvement in the alleged intelligence-linked sexual blackmail operation, which is what you were saying. And this is the materializing larger aspect, right? And this is why I think it's interesting that they are, we know the Epstein sexual activity as much as they still try to pretend like it's conspiracy theory in any other realm, but that's being put to bed with this story. And this is what you're uncovering here, is this larger network that ties to the intelligence groups, ties to the Israeli government, ties to the U.S., and this is what they're trying to put to bed with this story to make, for people that are trying to wrap their minds around what this is. And it's interesting. And this ties back to one of the larger parts that I would argue the largest part of this article, which is Kroll Industries, which ties, it's what the article you point out is called the CIA of Wall Street. So can you touch on that, tie into this, and how that relates to this case?
Sure, but before I get to Kroll, I'd like to point out that out of all of the cases regarding the Epstein and the Epstein network right now, or Ghislaine Maxwell, that involve his financial activities, is this Deutsche Bank case. That's the only one examining his financial activities. The only other case that's really attempting anyway to delve into that aspect of the case is the one that's ongoing in the Virgin Islands, right, outside of the U.S. So the fact that this is the one, this act against the judge occurs in the only case involving Epstein's financial connections within the U.S., I think is pretty significant. But anyway, so a big focus of the article, yes, is Kroll Associates, or Kroll Inc., or just Kroll, I guess you could say, which was first founded in the early 70s by Jules Kroll, who he essentially is credited with inventing like corporate intelligence or business intelligence firms. It definitely became a big player in Wall Street, mainly in the 1980s, where he was doing things that actually during that same period of time Epstein was doing, which involves hunting down money flows or embezzled funds on behalf of governments and corporations. But they're also capable of doing the opposite of well and expertly hiding that money, something that Epstein was also did during this time when he described himself as a financial bounty hunter, right, and things like that. So that's essentially what Kroll is known for. Initially, anyway, they later get into security services for executive bodyguards, things like that. And then after the Iraq War, for example, they get into the whole, they become mercenaries for the U.S. government. They became a client of USAID in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, USAID is a CIA front. But anyway, in the 1980s, when they were doing all of that financial investigative activity, they were called the CIA of Wall Street. A big part of this is because most of the people they hire are former government officials, mainly former CIA officers and former FBI officers, as well as major figures in law enforcement in the United States, including former commissioners for NYPD, LAPD, things like that. And then they're also known to hire large or considerable amount of people from Mossad and also from, the UK's MI6. So, definitely it's basically a firm of ex-spooks, and a lot of people, accurately point out that the line between spook and ex-spook is like quite thin, especially when you're, involving Wall Street, because let's remember the first CIA director, right, Alan Dulles, originally worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, a Wall Street law firm that essentially did what the CIA would do later, like coups against governments that went against like U.S. corporations and things like that. Sullivan and Cromwell did that before the CIA was created, and the CIA essentially took that over. So, CIA of Wall Street really isn't that different from what the actual CIA does, right? So why is Kroll relevant in this case? Well, the alleged shooter, this Roy Denhollander character, worked for Kroll in the late 90s up until the year 2000. And before that, Kroll was also very involved with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the creation of an oligarch class in Russia that benefited the West, which of course involved covert CIA involvement, lots of movement from top officials in the George H.W. Bush administration. Allegedly also involved Robert Maxwell to an extent because of some odd things that he was involved with in the lead up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And things like that. And during that period of time, Denhollander was a lawyer intimately involved in that process and was advising Russia's government during that period of time. And of course, Kroll in that same period of time had been hired by Russia's government to investigate money flows and whatnot. And one of the people in charge of that was the former CIA station chief in Cairo in the Middle East, right? And then later on, this Denhollander guy gets added to that. But it seems that Denhollander at some point had a falling out with this Orbit, I guess you could say, because he married a woman that he later claimed was linked to Russian organized crime, which of course was also really involved in this oligarch class that was being built with Western complicity, right? And anyway, he eventually divorced from her and claimed that there was this conspiracy, whether you believe it or not. This is what he claimed, right? Of the Russian mob and this guy, like people in NYPD, and this big conspiracy aimed at ruining his name through his relationship with this woman, right? So it seems like he had some sort of falling out with them at some point. The mainstream media narrative now about this Denhollander guy is also really weird, because what they're saying now is that, it's because he's a male rights activist. He hates women. And so I guess, we can go into why that's weird for a couple different reasons. First of all, this guy was definitely not publicity shy. He went on places like the Opie and Anthony show, the Colbert Report. He was into getting his face out there. So if he allegedly went on this rampage because he was so mad, he didn't release a video or a manifesto like all these other, past mass shooters that are ideologically motivated for these same reasons or looking to settle a score, that are publicity hungry. Allegedly, a couple days after he was found, NBC News obtained some manifesto of his that was nowhere on the internet when the shooting took place. It just like magically appeared like over 48 hours later, right? But it's just all very odd that this, angry males' right activist would shoot the two men in the house, but not the woman, right? It's just, there's a couple things that just stick out, right? That just seem really odd. So we don't really know what's going on, but what is significant is this Kroll tie-in. You have, a firm that hires ex-spooks from the US and from Israel, being involved in, the background of this guy during most of the 1990s. And then he's involved in this shooting targeting the judge who's overseeing this Epstein Deutsche Bank case. And it's worth pointing out, too, as I detail in the article, that Jules Kroll, after, in the 2000s, created this credit rating agency for Wall Street corporations called, abbreviated as KBRA, that is essentially part of this revolving door with Deutsche Bank executives. Pretty much every top person at KBRA was previously a vice president or a director of a major aspect of Deutsche Bank's New York operations, right? So it's very interesting that we're seeing, that a person with that background being accused of shooting, killing the son of this judge and wounding her husband.
Yeah, the whole thing strikes me, and probably anyone that's follows these things, as something that's very self-serving, and it's a perfect fit for what they want to remove, to carry your gaze away from all the things that you're writing about. And any actual journalist worth their salt would be at least mentioning these things in regard to this very interesting
case. They haven't mentioned Kroll at all. Like
exactly.
All the mainstream media reports, they're just like angry males' right activist.
Right.
That didn't shoot a woman, he shot two men. It's just weird.
Yeah, it very much is. Now, I know you're short on time today and you got other things to get to. I think it's very interesting, the idea of what you wrote about in this article. This essentially, whereas it was the Wall Street or CIA, the idea that Kroll, but now we have this idea that there's this private CIA, which you kind of wrote about here. It's this private version. And that's really interesting in regard to the discussion of the divide in this country, or even the idea of the Epstein kind of Acosta discussion of foreign influence, whether that's what that is. It's just really alarming to see that. Even going back to the continuity of government thing you wrote about in regard to the shadow government that was built under Reagan. I mean, these are all these same kind of ideas that represent an alternative government, the shadow government, the unelected power structure. And that's what we're always trying to point out. But the one of the last things I'd like you to just touch on in general is the connections that you see here in regard to the government, whether that's Trump, left or right, or however you think that are relevant people to know about for the current administration or current people in government.
You mean related to Kroll?
Or just in general, the case, the Kroll and the action here, the Epstein cases and all this stuff. Do you find that or if there is any, do you feel that right now there's any obvious connections between whether it's left or right people in our government that, may have some kind of drive to be a part of this? Because I find it very hard to believe that this wouldn't have some kind of tie back to somebody currently in our government.
Well, obviously, the more you probe Deutsche Bank, the more uncomfortable Trump and Kushner are going to be. There have been efforts to, obviously for political reasons most of the time, by people like Jeffrey Berman, for example, to try and get, Trump's tax returns or elucidate some of his shadier loan deals with Deutsche Bank that, some of which weren't supposed to happen, but, were signed off on well before he became president, right? And then you have the matter of the Kushners as well, not just Jared Kushner, but his father having connections to Deutsche Bank that are rather suspect. I mean, Deutsche Bank is very involved in a lot of very shady activity and has been, for a very long time, not unlike most other Wall Street banks, right? So, but it's worth pointing out, too, that it's not just Trump and Kushner that could stand to lose from this. One of the people very central to Epstein's sexual blackmail operation and connecting him to powerful people is Lynn Forrester, who married into the Rothschild family. So she's now known as Lady Rothschild or Lynn Forrester Rothschild, right? And she is one of the main people that helped get Epstein connected to Bill Clinton in the 1990s. And she is also the person that introduced Epstein to Alan Dershowitz, for example. So a lot of the big names connected to Epstein all arrived to Epstein through this lady. And of course, as a member of, this elite banking family and all of that, and previously was involved in another, New York elite sort of mobbed up family, actually related to Louis Rosenstiel, who I write about in my Epstein series. Well, that was her first husband. She is intimately involved also in Deutsche Bank in their microfinance consortium, right? So she definitely is a direct tie between Epstein and Deutsche Bank stuff. It's definitely very, Lynn Forrester is very involved in the Clintons in general, a longtime donor to the Clintons and supporter of them, Hillary's campaign in 2016, and every Bill Clinton campaign was actually part of a an important panel of the Department of Energy when Clinton was president, and some other things that were going on, right? So there's definitely other people that could stand, to lose from this as well, particularly the Epstein Deutsche Bank connection. Though it's worth pointing out that Epstein, his whole creation of this investment firm that was basically that he used as a vehicle for financing the sexual blackmail operation, among other things, was created partially with Deutsche Bank loans, according to Steve Hoffenberg, his former business partner. And that was back in the early 1990s when this sexual blackmail operation was first taking place. So, I mean, there definitely are a lot of interconnections and what's going on that are definitely, of concern for sure. But like I was saying, Deutsche Bank doesn't just service people that we're talking about, the big names that we can drop right now. There's a lot of, they have a lot of connections to a lot of different things. And they're also a bank that's been in danger of essentially going bankrupt. A lot of people think they've been bankrupt for years and are barely propping themselves up. A lot of people think that, when the banking system starts to collapse again, not unlike it did in 2008, that Deutsche Bank will be the one that falls first. Essentially, the Bear Stearns or the Lehman Brothers of the 2008 crisis will be Deutsche Bank in this next upcoming crisis, right? So there's definitely a lot of different things at play that are definitely worth looking into, but it's very possible that, this Epstein Deutsche Bank case itself, were Deutsche Bank's activities to be placed under scrutiny in this case, would reveal, the fact that the bank is bankrupt, and that could essentially lead to another financial collapse, right? So, this could very easily go beyond just the Epstein connection.
Yeah, well said. And I mean, my conspiratorial mind, I'm sure you can recognize. I see this as something that makes more sense to be, my opinion, obviously, covering up what you're really focusing on in this article, this network that exists much larger than just the sexual blackmail that ties back to left and right. That's what's important.
I should point out, too, that the stuff that was going on in Russia during this period of time when Kroll was there and this Den Hollander guy was there, also involved people like Larry Summers, who became Secretary of Treasury under Clinton. He was involved in this privatization stuff. He was also really close to Epstein, right? Let's remember, too, that a lot of the girls that Epstein trafficked came from Russia. Or Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union countries. There's definitely a lot of ties, I think, to some of what Epstein was doing. Because remember, his sexual blackmail operation, sex trafficking operation, it was not just in the US, it was global, right? So there's definitely very possible that there's a lot of, tie-ins to other very powerful people in the Epstein case that were going on in this period of time when Den Hollander was also involved in this nexus. But like I said, he appeared to have some sort of falling out with them at some point. There's also something I would like to bring up, but I haven't had a chance to investigate it myself, but I was tipped off that Den Hollander was also involved at the time of him being found with a gunshot wound to the head after this shooting took place, right? To have been involved in litigation involving human trafficking cases. I don't know. I haven't personally looked into that because, like I said, I wrote this article. It came out on Monday, and I've been working on my series on the Maxwell family. But anyone that's watching that's interested in looking into that, that could definitely add a very interesting element to this case and why, Den Hollander was found dead and why he's been, why he is now being described as the alleged shooter, despite there being, he was very quickly named the suspect before there was any, real investigation. Of course, conveniently found dead before, he could be questioned or arrested or anything like that, right?
Yeah, as usual, quite self-serving, right? Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for letting people giving your insight into this story, because this is just incredibly deep. As I said, there's so many. I definitely feel that the Maxwell Epstein part of this, in a way, is meant to cap this off, so we don't keep looking, which I felt was your larger point in this article. So well done. So,
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and anything else you want to drop before you take off?
All I really have to say is that I have an article upcoming about Isabel Maxwell that is going to be really wild. So you guys can look for that. I should have it out for patrons probably sometime this week and should go live for everyone else on the weekend.
Sounds great. Well, I'll make sure and talk about it at the time. And thank you for being here.
Thanks.
All right. Well, there's so much more to get into today, so let's get on to some other stuff. Actually, one last thing that I wanted to show you on the topic of Epstein and Maxwell and Deutsche Bank and